For nearly half a century, the entire world was living on a knife's edge. Two massive superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, were locked in this epic struggle that didn't just define an era, it completely reshaped the globe and, yeah, brought humanity terrifyingly close to nuclear war. That, right there, was the Cold War. And in this explainer, we're going to break down that 45-year standoff that still casts a long shadow over the world we live in today. You'd think, after the absolute devastation of World War II, everyone would be ready for peace. But that hope, it faded fast. In 1946, Winston Churchill gets up and gives this now famous speech. And with just one powerful phrase, he paints this vivid picture of a new, grim reality. This Iron Curtain. It wasn't a real wall. Not yet, anyway. It was an idea. A stark, ideological dividing line that was slicing Europe right in two. Because at its heart, the Cold War was a clash between two completely opposite ways of seeing the world. On one side, you've got the United States, pushing capitalism and democracy, and their main goal, to contain communism, to stop it from spreading. And on the other side, you have the Soviet Union, built on communism and total state control, trying to expand its influence everywhere it could. These two ideas just could not coexist peacefully. That was the engine of the entire conflict.
So this ideological battle, it wasn't just talk. It immediately started carving up the map, turning the allies who fought together in World War II into these bitter, bitter rivals. And the first, most critical battleground was Europe.
So what was the American game plan? Well, it all boiled down to one simple but really powerful idea: containment. The whole strategy was basically this. We're not necessarily going to try and roll back communism where it already exists, but we are going to draw a line in the sand, and we will not let it spread 1 inch further. That was the policy. And boy, did that policy get tested right out of the gate in Berlin. Now, the city was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but half of it was controlled by the West. Stalin, wanting to force them out, just blockades West Berlin. He cuts off all food, all fuel, everything. The response? Absolutely incredible. The Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, American and Allied planes flew supplies in 24/7. They brought everything from coal to chocolate, keeping 2 million people alive. It was a huge victory, and it was one without a single shot being fired. Okay, so a direct war between the two superpowers, that was just too risky. I mean, everybody knew it meant nuclear war, the end of everything. So instead, they fought each other indirectly, using other countries' conflicts all across the globe as their own personal chessboard. And this brings us to a super important concept for this whole era, the proxy war. Basically, the US and the USSR would pick opposite sides in a local conflict, and then they'd pour in money, weapons, and advisors. So you wouldn't have American soldiers fighting Soviet soldiers directly, but you'd have American troops in a place like Vietnam fighting North Vietnamese soldiers who were using Soviet tanks and Soviet rifles. It was kind of like waging war by remote control. So you might be asking, why? Why get tangled up in all these conflicts so far from home? Well, the justification was this really powerful idea called the domino theory. U.S. leaders genuinely believed that if just one country, let's say Vietnam, fell to communism, it would set off this chain reaction. All its neighbors would fall, one by one, just like a line of dominoes. And that fear, that theory, drove American foreign policy for decades. But you have to remember, all of these proxy wars, all this political maneuvering, it was all happening under a much, much larger and, frankly, more terrifying shadow, the nuclear arms race. This is what pushed the entire planet to the very edge of total destruction. The logic of the nuclear age was, well, it was grim. And it had the most fitting acronym you can imagine. MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. What it meant was simple. If one side launched its nukes, the other side would have just enough time to launch theirs back before the first ones hit. The result? The complete and total annihilation of both countries, and probably the rest of the world too. It's a terrifying paradox, right? The very weapon that could end civilization was also what kept the peace between the superpowers. And in October of 1962, that peace, it almost shattered. American spy planes discovered the Soviets were secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. What came next was 13 days of the most intense tension in human history. Kennedy put a naval blockade around the island. Soviet ships carrying more missiles steamed right for that line. And for those 2 weeks, the entire world literally held its breath, because nuclear war didn't just seem possible, it felt inevitable. This was the closest we have ever come to the end. And just to really grasp the scale of the danger we're talking about, look at this number. At the peak of the Cold War, the combined nuclear arsenals of the US and the USSR topped 60,000 warheads. It's a number that's almost impossible to even comprehend. Just enough firepower to destroy the world many, many times over. After the absolute shock of the Cuban Missile Crisis, things had to change. The conflict entered a new phase, and the final decades saw these weird swings, from periods of calm to renewed hostility, and then an ending that almost nobody saw coming. The 1970s brought a period we call détente. It's a French word that just means an easing of tensions. Both sides kind of looked over the cliff, saw the abyss, and decided to take a step back. They started talking more, opening diplomatic channels, and they even signed the first big treaties to limit the number of nuclear weapons. It was a fragile thaw for sure, but it was a start.
But that thaw, well, it didn't last. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79 really soured things, and then the election of Ronald Reagan in the US completely changed the game. Reagan just flat out rejected détente. He took a much more aggressive stance, famously calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. The arms race wasn't just back on, it was kicked into high gear.
And then, in 1985, a totally new kind of leader comes to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. He could see that the system was totally rotten from the inside out and was about to collapse, so he introduced these two radical new policies: glasnost, which means openness, more free speech, and perestroika, which was all about restructuring the broken economy. But the most crucial thing he did, he admitted out loud that the Soviet Union was going broke and simply could not keep up with the arms race anymore. What happened next was just stunning. Gorbachev's reforms, plus his signal that he wasn't going to send in the tanks to prop up communist governments in Eastern Europe, it was like opening a floodgate. In one single breathtaking year, 1989, the entire Soviet bloc just fell apart. Poland held free elections, Hungary opened its border, Czechoslovakia had its Velvet Revolution, and then the big one, on November 9th, the Berlin Wall came down. I mean, just pause and think about that for a second. The Berlin Wall, the most powerful physical symbol of the Iron Curtain, it wasn't destroyed in a battle. There were no invading armies. It was brought down by ordinary people, with hammers and pickaxes and just pure hope, demanding their freedom. So this is the big question, right? How did a 45-year global struggle, a conflict that defined generations, end so suddenly and with so little violence? Why did one of the world's two superpowers just disappear? Well, it wasn't any one single thing. It was more like a total system failure. The Soviet economy had been a mess for years, unable to even provide basic goods for its people, all while it was being bled dry by massive military spending and a disastrous decade-long war in Afghanistan. When Gorbachev tried to reform the system, all he did was show everyone how broken it really was, and that unleashed these popular movements for freedom that he just couldn't control anymore. The official end came on Christmas Day, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev went on TV, resigned as president of a country that, for all practical purposes, didn't exist anymore. And just like that, the hammer and sickle flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Cold War was over. The Cold War shaped our entire world, from the borders on maps to the technology in our hands. But it ended not with a bang, but with a fizzle. One of the most powerful empires in history literally collapsed under the weight of its own problems. And that leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. What is real power? Is it the number of missiles you have, or is it found in the economic strength and the political will of your people?